This is John Dower from North Kingstown. He is he's the past president of Smith's Castle House Museum, and I believe he's still active in its programs. John has been doing extensive research on men of color who served in the Black Regiment during the American Revolution. That research resulted in a current exhibit at the Museum of the U.S. Army. That is in Fort Belvoir, Virginia. And he's writing a book on the subject of the Black Regiment.
Great.
John offers a unique perspective on this story, because he's a descendant of slave owners as well as the enslaved. So, thank you, John.
Thank you. All right, thank you everybody for joining us here tonight. I can tell just by looking out there that I'm going to need to hurry through the presentation because this looks like a group that's going to have some questions. And I love the questions. So thanks for joining us here, the presentation, the Segregated Black Regiment. Before we get started there, I'd like to thank the Preservation Society for asking me to speak here tonight. I did a similar program by Zoom, I think it was 4 years ago. It was the tail end of the COVID pandemic. So if you happen to see that, this is going to be a little bit different. There's some updated stuff in here that we're going to talk about. I'd like to thank the Rhode Island 250 Commission for supporting these events. My friends at the Battle of Rhode Island who promoted this on their website. Joanne and Mike I see here. Thank them for posting it on their social media. And Smith's Castle also posted it. So Black History Month, that's why we're talking about the Black Regiment right now. When we get to the end, if we've got time, I'm going to touch on Black history just a little bit in a general manner. So the Segregated Black Regiment, some of you have heard others out there, whether it's on TV or other presentations, things written, you'll hear it described as the first integrated fighting unit in America. And that's not what it was. Integrated sounds better. It's a better sounding word. I think we can all agree with that. But this unit was a group of men that were segregated. And you'll see more of that as we move on. And created in East Greenwich, Rhode Island, right here. This is where most of what I'm going to be talking about took place. Segregated. As you're soon going to see, set apart from each other, isolated, or divided. And I'm not going to read many slides, but this one I'm going to read. It's very important. To whom it may concern, I, Thomas Holden of Warwick, was a captain in General Barnum's regiment in the year 1775. It went to Boston, the first campaign, and Windsor Fry was a soldier in my company. I think a lot of people in this room know who Windsor Fry was. Windsor Fry was a black man that lived here in East Greenwich and served nearly the entire war. He was a man of color. There were other men of color that were in that group that went to Boston. That was the first integrated unit. So if you hear people describe it as the integrated, I'm not criticizing those that may say it. I'm just correcting them because it was not the first integrated unit. This was the first integrated unit. And there were others that followed. Barnum's regiment expanded the following month, became designated the 12th Continental Regiment. They added another regiment the following year. And during this whole time period, there was a roller coaster of whether they were going to allow men of color, particularly black men, to participate. And they went back and forth on that. But by the time we get to January of 1777, when they decide to now start calling the two regiments, the 1st Rhode Island Regiment and the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment, by the time we get there, there's numerous men of color that have enlisted. Over 24 men of color in each one of those units by the time we get to 1777. So they were integrated units. They were predominantly white men, but we did have a pretty good number of men of color. All integrated. All of those units were integrated. Important date here to note, by the time we get to January 1781, Rhode Island is no longer required to provide 2 regiments. They only need to provide 1. It becomes just the Rhode Island Regiment. So you'll hear more about that as we go on. So the story kind of starts in 1776 when Continental Congress and the military officials decide if we're going to beat the British, we have to provide men. We have to have manpower. So they designate how many regiments each state must provide. Little Rhode Island, got to come up with 2 regiments. None of these states did a good job. That was a problem throughout the entire war, was providing enough men. There's a book out there, and I know the author, but Almost a Miracle. If you read how this war was won, you wouldn't believe it. And the numbers were very difficult to meet. So we got James Mitchell Varnum, George Washington. They'd had a lot of correspondence back and forth. How are we going to come up with these numbers? And poor George had the same conversation with 12 other people. So he was really having a difficult time getting the numbers they needed. January 2nd, 1778, James Mitchell Varnum, in a letter to George Washington, it is imagined that a battalion of Negroes can easily be raised there. There, being back here in Rhode Island, because Varnum was in Valley Forge at the time. A couple other words to note there. Battalion. Battalion and regiment, often interchangeable. Number minimally looking for 400 men, somewhere in that area. But the word imagine is a very interesting word there. If you read the whole letter, Varnum supported this idea, but he gave himself some cover. It was suggested to him by his officers to come up with this idea. So he gave himself a little bit of cover, but I believe he supported the idea. We'll talk more in a few minutes about who I think it was that most strongly suggested the idea to him. So where did they come up with this idea? Military census. I'll give you some other numbers up there just for context. The size, the population of the colony of Rhode Island in 1774. And then down here, these numbers represent men able to bear arms, 16 to 60-year-old men. Pretty wide range. But what I'm sure jumped off the page at them was, well, we have 404 enslaved men in Rhode Island. I don't think the owners would mind us enlisting them, because that means then the owners and their family don't have to participate. So look at that number down there, 7,104 white men. This recruiting effort was going to be targeted just at men of color. Couldn't have come up with 300 or 400 white men. Now, to be honest and be fair and factual, there were white men that were recruited during this time period, but not in the numbers that we see recruited for this black regiment. So what happens is Washington sends a copy of the letter. I always like when I read a copy of the letter. They didn't have copying machines. Did somebody have to sit down and write the letter all out? I guess that's what they did. But he sent a copy of the letter from Varnum back here to the officials in Rhode Island, and they ran with it. So right down the hill here, in the old courthouse, the General Assembly met February 14th of 1778, and they passed a law. This one I'm not going to read. I'll let everybody read that, and I'll get a drink here quickly. Okay, everybody caught up? Looks pretty straightforward. You're enslaved. You sign the enlistment form with your ex in most cases. Most of the men that enlisted were not able to read and write. You're free. Sounds pretty simple. A couple things wrong with the original version of this that was written up. It says enlist into either of the said 2 battalions. Well, the Rhode Island 1st and the Rhode Island 2nd were integrated, but what they did, the military leaders made a little decision here to segregate the 2. So that's where it happened. When we get to the end, if someone wants to ask me my thoughts on why they decided to do that, I'll share, but I'll save that for the end. So they really were going to end up in the 1st Rhode Island. 1st Rhode Island became just the men of color, led by white officers, and the 2nd Rhode Island became only white men. And those men are still back in Valley Forge. These men are being recruited right here in Rhode Island. And this is a document that brought me into wanting to research the Black Regiment. I didn't know how big a story was. It's much bigger than I ever anticipated it was. But I was reading as much as I could about the Black Regiment, and I'm finding out that everybody has a different number for how many enslaved men they believe had enlisted. I'm seeing numbers that are all over the place. I said, can't somebody sit down and actually do that? Well, I figured out why no one had done it, because it took me months and months of going through records to find out. This document right here, General Treasurer's accounting book, and on the left side we have the name of the enslaved man that enlisted. In the middle we have the enslaver's name. Next to that we have the town of residence, and then a troubling part of this document. On the far right side, we have a value that was placed on each of these men. Their owners were compensated. That wasn't originally part of the act, and they realized that the owners were not happy about it. So they set up a committee, and the committee would inspect the enslaved man that enlisted and decide how much the owner would be compensated. A sad part of this whole story, but it gets worse. So most of the men on here are valued somewhere between 100 and the maximum 120 pounds. The vast majority. We've got a couple numbers under 100. We've got a couple numbers that are odd numbers. 114, 93. Leads me to think that the committee members sat there and dickered over how much money they thought the enslaver should get. The only reason this list exists for the treasurer is so they could pay the enslaver. That's the only reason this list exists. And there's 88 men on it, but it wasn't just 88 men. There were a few dozen more men that enlisted that I found the records on. But the sad part is, right down here, about 2/3 of the way down, is a man named Rudder Gardner from Exeter. He was valued at 30 pounds. If 120 pounds is a man in the prime of his life, which most of these men were, average age was just over 20, what does 30 pounds represent? Well, I couldn't find anything specific, but I've got to believe he was a feeble old man. Why would they even let him in? Well, I think it was a moment of compassion by the recruiters, and then the officers decided to let him stay. That man wanted to be free so bad late in his life that they gave him an opportunity to be free. Story doesn't end well. He got sick, got an early discharge a few months later. They tried to return him to his enslaver, who would not take him back. He ended up going into another home where they took him in. And I imagine that, like most of the men that died during the American Revolution, he had a disease that eventually killed him, because I find no record of him after this time period. That's really the heart of this story for me, is a story like that, is a man that wanted his freedom so bad he was willing to risk his life to have a very short period as a free man. So I finally found the number, 126. That's taken me a few years and going through a lot of different documents to find it. And it's not 72, as some people have written. It's not the 88 that we see on that one document. Some historians say it was between 150 and 200 enslaved men. It wasn't that high. It wasn't the 400 they expected. But we take that 126 and we add another 61 men. 43 of them are the veterans that are back at Valley Forge that eventually will find their way to Rhode Island to make this a complete regiment of sorts. Never reached 200 men, and by the time we get to the Battle of Rhode Island, the number is really down closer to 120 due to disease, some men that died at the Battle of Monmouth, some men that were wounded at the Battle of Monmouth, some men that were sick and never made it over to Aquidneck Island for the Battle of Rhode Island. This only went on, the recruiting only went on from February 14th to June 10th. Eventually, the General Assembly, there were some new members elected, and there was a lot of pressure to discontinue this, so they put an end date of June 10th. Otherwise, I think the number could have gotten up closer to 200 potentially, just a guess on my part. So on paper, June, May 1778, we got some overlapping documents, but we have about 187 men that are considered part of the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, which would be known by many as the Black Regiment. Just to give you a little context, by the end of December in 1780, that number's down to 109. In that 2.5, almost 3-year period, they only recruited 10 more men. They lost 88. About 24 of them were free men that had enlisted in 1777, and they were only required to enlist for 3 years if they chose to. Men like Windsor Fry, he said, no, I'm signing up again. I'm here for the whole thing. So we're down to 109, 60 some after we take the men whose terms had ended. The remainder of those, most of them died of disease. We've got some battlefield casualties and some deserters. And while I'm talking deserters, this group, a fair amount lower percentage of desertions than you found across other military units for the Americans during the American Revolution. I'll throw this little note in there. 1781, that January, I think between January and February, over a dozen indigenous men enlisted, and that's going to be important here in just a second. So what I have is a data file with all of the men, owners if there was an enslaver, everything pertinent. So I have that, but then the old school side of me, I've got about 2,000 index cards that sit on a table in my office. So I have a lot of information on these men. This is probably my favorite document for finding information It's the regimental book, and it's in the state archives, and this lists the enslaved man or the free man. There's also free men listed. But you see right third up from the bottom there is Windsor Fry. We have 3 Champlains listed there. There were even more Champlains listed. And at this point, I usually like to clarify something. If you hear me say a name that has anything to do with people that were enslavers, I'm not singling anybody out. These are just factual information, part of the story. And I also throw in that probably the man that was most responsible for enslavement in Rhode Island was Richard Smith, who's my 10th great-grandfather, and he had enslaved men at that plantation that he started at least as early as 1651. So those of you that didn't realize that enslavement went on for a very long time here. More on that later. So the other thing I needed to do, I've had historians talk to me and say, well, we can't call it the Black Regiment. And I say, why can't we call it the Black Regiment? Well, it isn't fair to the Native American, the indigenous that participated. And first off, very few men could I find that were Native American that were enslaved. And that's a good story. We at least were moving away from that. Only one of the men that I found, enslaved men that enlisted, is described as an Indian, terminology they used back then. Most of the men were black. I didn't come up with the name the Black Regiment. There's where the name came from. The vast majority of men that I could identify, anything associated with their race, 95 of them were black. We've got the 2 categories of mixed race, and then the 13 indigenous, but that includes 12 free men that were already in the 1st or the 2nd Rhode Island from the year before. And if I took that number 70 there, and historians aren't supposed to guess, not supposed to assume things, but we can interpret. And what I can interpret is that the 70 men remaining there, the vast majority of them have first names that are all strongly associated with enslaved African people. So I bet if we knew all of it, it would show the numbers even higher for black men. And this is not anything to discredit indigenous people. You'll see in a minute, I mentioned that quite a few joined the early part of 1781, and I think that's where this story gets a little bit distorted about the Black Regiment. If you were walking the streets...
Excuse me, what is meant by musty?
Musty is half indigenous and half African.
Thank you.
And mulatto is half European, half African. But I'm glad you brought that up. Here's the big thing. I bet the majority of all these men of color, if you really could check their DNA, mixed race. The races were mixed considerably. So if you were walking the streets here in East Greenwich in 1778, you saw these men marching, you would say that's a regiment of black men. And that was the term they used, and I continue to use it, although I'm occasionally criticized for it. Here's some other things that came out in the demographics. Place of residence. Again, we got 52 unknown. If I had the time to go out into each town and go through some of their records, I probably could find a few more in there. But nothing surprising there. The plantations, South Kingstown, North Kingstown, Newport, no problem with the British there, but there were men that had managed to get over here either prior to or during the recruiting effort. if the British were not in Newport, pretty sure we'd see a number higher than South Kingstown, because Newport had a much higher population of enslaved people. What else do we have there? You'll see one from Connecticut, one from Maryland, listed in this first group of 187. A man from Connecticut was a free man from Stonington, and they would, if you were a free man from somewhere else, the Continental Line would take you wherever you showed up. Maryland, that's a different story. He shows up in Valley Forge claiming to be a free man and is in for, I think, over 3 years. And he's wandering through Philadelphia, and someone recognizes him as a self-emancipator, runaway, and he gets returned to his enslaver in Maryland. So this is just a quick summary of what the Black Regiment was. Segregated unit made up of men of color with white officers. I think we can all admit that if we took all the black men and the indigenous men and put them over here, and we put all the white men over there, that it's not we're not talking integrated, that's segregated. So that's what we have. Only in existence as that group of men that were segregated from February of 1778 until the end of December 1780. And then, as I said, they reorganized it, one regiment. Eventually, less black men were recruited, and that shows up because we have that number 10. Only 10 men are recruited over that almost 3-year period. So the Black Regiment was small with a fairly short existence. They became the Rhode Island Regiment when the first with the men of color and the second with the white men were merged. They were together less than 3 years. So we'll talk about this guy for just a couple seconds here. Christopher Green, I believe he's the one that talked to James Mitchell Varnum at Valley Forge. And one of the reasons I believe that, if you know anything about him, he was very successful with units of integrated soldiers before that. Red Bank, Fort Mifflin, a couple other places. So he already knew that black men were capable of being the equal to white men on the battlefield. So he's back in Rhode Island finally. He's right here in East Greenwich. I don't know where he was staying, but he needs to get a hold of all his recruiters and officers that are out in the field. No cell phones to pick up, and pretty difficult. I mean, if you think about it, he couldn't even send somebody out on horseback because he doesn't know where these men are. Rhode Island isn't very big, but they could be anywhere in Rhode Island. So what does he do? What the military commonly did, run an ad in the newspaper and hope it gets out there. And the men would know to look in the newspaper and see if there were announcements in there. So March 28th, he's telling the men out in the field, now they're not done recruiting yet, but they've got a pretty good start, and he wants to have them bring in the men that are being recruited out in the field, and they're going to start setting up the companies and dividing them up. Jeremiah Greenman, a white soldier from Rhode Island, he was out there as a recruiter. And this is the entry he had on March 27th. This morn we paraded our slaves for the march to Greenwich. And that's the spelling that you see quite often by people that were not quite as literate. He was pretty literate at the time, but my suggestion would be to the people from East Greenwich here, I would leave the spelling the same. I don't know that that word does much for you. All right, where does all of this bring us? Let's check off the boxes. Home of James Mitchell Varnum. He's really given most of the credit for the idea, but as I said, on British Guards, Christopher Green, Multiple other officers came out of the Kentish Guards that were leaders of the Black Regiment. The act was passed right here, and I don't think I touched on this. There was not a capital in Rhode Island, so they rotated the meeting area for the General Assembly, and East Greenwich was one of the places. Newport was also one, but they weren't really welcome over there at that time, so it took place here. Staging area, as we just saw, for the recruits. They camped and trained here for months before the Battle of Rhode Island, and then after the Battle of Rhode Island, they were here patrolling the area extensively. Now, Kentish Guards did a lot of that, but there were times and areas where the Black Regiment filled in the gaps. So these are 5 areas most closely associated with the Black Regiment. Fort Daniel, they not only trained there, but I believe they initially patrolled that area after the Battle of Rhode Island, and the Kentish Guards were allowed to go home. Continental guys not allowed to go home. They had to continue on. Academy Field, that area was actually designated by the General Assembly as the training grounds for all of Rhode Island. So different militias, state militia, all trained there. Matt gave me an old map, and I don't know where he got it, but it shows an area called the Training and Burying Ground. And I believe there was only one man that died during the initial training that took place there. He was killed by a signal cannon, which has a huge bore on it, and I think it was one of those, how come that didn't go off situations. Not a good way to die, because he didn't die right away. It was about 2 days later. Smallpox Hospital, I think the area is called Fry's Corners, or Fry Corners. Forge Farm, Richard Green, that owned Forge Farm. His cousin was Christopher Green, second cousin maybe. Richard entertained the officers there at his house, and I find mention of a distance of how far it would be to get from their camp to Quidnesset. A lot of raiding party stuff took place at Quidnesset and at Quonset also. And when I kind of triangulate where they're talking, it looks like it's right around there. And if I was Richard Green, and I know there's raiding parties coming over from Newport, loyalists and British soldiers at different times, I would say, yeah, go ahead, let them camp here. So I think that took place. I'm going to talk quickly about the Battle of Rhode Island, because the Black Regiment, much of their story involves the Battle of Rhode Island. And I'm just going to give a quick summary of the Battle of Rhode Island so everybody has the context. It's kind of important to this story. So the British are occupying Newport. The Americans had several times tried to figure out a way to push them out. And finally the plan came together. The French are in Boston. They've got a big fleet. They brought soldiers with them. They were going to try and do a couple other things in other places. New York they had thought about, Philadelphia they had thought about, but finally somebody said, let's do Newport. And they agreed. So they send the fleet to Newport. General Sullivan has the Americans entering Aquidneck Island from the north. They're going to go down. They're going to time this perfectly. The French are going to show up with their ships. They're going to bring extra troops with them. They're going to start blasting away at them from the ships. All sounds great. Sullivan jumped the gun a little bit. He got there a little earlier. French finally show up, and who else shows up? A British fleet from New York. So they have a big naval battle, area roughly between Newport and Block Island, I guess, is where most of it was. A lot of damage to the ships from that, But to make it worse, a hurricane blows in, and the ships on both sides are heavily damaged. French limped back to Boston. The British limped back to New York. French never dropped off the 6,000 troops they were supposed to drop off as reinforcements for the Americans. So you got 10,000 British soldiers there, and you have somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 eventually there for the American side. And then the bad news, the really bad news comes. The British are sending reinforcements on other ships. So Sullivan and the others said, you know what, let's cut our losses and get off the island. So they do a planned retreat going off the island, but the British decide, hey, wait a minute. In Monmouth, we were trying to retreat, and you chased us down and killed a bunch of us. So they decide they're going to do some retaliation here. That leads us, a plug there for the Battle of Rhode Island Association, to the artillery redoubt. It's on a little knoll up in Portsmouth. It was referred to as Durfee Hill, Turkey Hill, and I think there was a third name for it. It's a little earthen fort built onto this little knoll. And the blue lines are the Americans retreating. The red lines, there were two groups of British, one on the east side of the island and another group led by Hessians on the west side of the island. For some strange reason that I have yet to figure out, I've got some ideas, but everybody is moving except the Black Regiment. They're the last ones left at this artillery redoubt, had an apple orchard out in front of it. They are there. Everybody else is ahead of them when this group of Hessians, considered to be as many as 800 men. So we've got these trained soldiers that make contact with the Black Regiment first. It doesn't sound like a good scenario. Many of you have probably heard the story of the Black Regiment repelling the 3 charges of the Hessians. Most of the time, they just leave it like that. They don't say that the Black Regiment was not alone. In some cases, they go the other extreme. On their own, the Black Regiment repelled this onslaught. It was stuff like this that started it, written back prior to the Civil War. I'll let you read it. Doesn't say they did it alone, but that exaggeration continued right into the 20th century, and we still hear it today. They were not alone. And we don't need to exaggerate it. It was 120 plus men that had never picked up a musket until a few months before, and they're being attacked by 800 Hessians. So we don't need to exaggerate it. They slowed the men down. I'll take this guy's word for it. He was there, Nathaniel Green, and I said I wasn't going to read, but I got to read this. You can read along with me, obviously. About 2 o'clock, the enemy began to advance in force upon our right as if they intended to dislodge us from the advance redoubt. Well, that's what they were intending. The Black Regiment were the last line of defense. I had the command of the right wing after advancing 4 regiments and finding the enemy still gaining ground. I advanced with 2 more regiments of regular troops and a brigade of militia, and at the same time General Sullivan ordered Colonel Livingston with the light troops under his command to advance. We soon put the enemy to rout, and I had the pleasure to see them run in worse disorder than they did at the Battle of Monmouth. That's the story. I've read all the accounts, everything I can find, and most of them line up with this. Black Regiment was in for a world of you-know-what in the beginning. These are serious soldiers that came after him. And one of the accounts, written by a Hessian soldier who was there, said that when we attacked the redoubt, we ran into a much more stubborn, obstinate resistance than we expected, and it was mostly black men that they ran into. So we don't need to exaggerate what they did. This is what went on during the entire American Revolution. It was a give and take every day. Fortunately, they slowed down. I think the best part of the story is, I think they knew that the Americans were going to get caught, and they made a decision on their own to turn and fight because they were alone there. All the accounts tell about them being alone there initially. I think they said, well, we either flee or fight, and the fleeing isn't working. So I think that's what we had happen here, and Nathaniel Greene nails it with his version of the events. So if we look at the casualties from there, like I said, by the time the real fighting took place, the number of Americans was probably down closer to 5,000. Some of the local militias that had been called in, they said, nope, after the hurricane, we're out of here. Not a really significant battle in terms of some of the bigger battles, but not insignificant either. The fact that it really ended with both sides turning and walking away leads a lot of historians not to focus on it as much as I wish they would. But here's the point. A lot of historians look at just men that showed dying that date, on that date that the battle took place, and that's 3. I look at least one other man that died a few days after that. He had not shown up in musters as having been sick before that or anything else. So I think he died of wounds. They didn't keep track of that. You look at the muster roll, all it says is died. Doesn't give the cause. And I think there's a 5th man that a few weeks later may have been injured on the battlefield. Think about it. If you were wounded on the battlefield, if that didn't kill you, infection probably would. Here's a picture that I show, and I showed part of it earlier. Many of you have probably seen it. Bob Geek shows it, has it on the cover of his book. A lot of other people show it. But it was a French lieutenant that was at Yorktown, and he painted the uniforms of the different soldiers. And there's man of color from the Rhode Island Regiment when they were combined, and that was the uniform they had by then. They'd got new uniforms on their way to Yorktown. I could do a whole night on this, and someday maybe I will. A couple of these men, a great deal of information on them. A couple of the men ended up, Ichabod Northup was actually from North Kingstown, and I think his house is still here in East Greenwich. They still with some kind of a designation, or am I thinking about something else? I think the Northup house is still listed somewhere. I'm going to be talking about Cato Varnum in a minute.
Are these all from the Black Regiment?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. All of them. And Matt and I have worked closely on trying to see if we could find any other men, but I think this is the list as it stands right now. So they're either men that lived here before and or after the war. But most of them were before. Prince Green, Thomas Spencer, Cato R. Green, George Sambo lived here, Cyrus Mauney lived here, Titus Pierce was here, Ichabod Northup was not, Windsor Fry was. A lot of you are familiar with this painting by Don Troiani, and the reason I show it, a couple reasons. It's a great picture. Barnum Armory has it on display there, but this is the Rhode Island Regiment now after the 1st and the 2nd were combined into one unit, But if you look on the far right, you have the tail end of a company of white soldiers, and then you have a company of all men of color behind that. So there were 10 companies, 2 of them were men of color. I haven't been able to square that yet. I mean, the regiment, yeah, it's integrated because it's got both, but we still have companies split up by race. So the legacy of the Black Regiment, I could talk all night about this, but I think these men proved they were equal to white men fighting on the battlefield. That's why we saw the roller coaster where they let them enlist, they didn't let them enlist, it went back and forth. But these men were equal to anybody on the battlefield. And just like any unit, you had men that were better than others, certainly. They proved themselves at the Battle of Rhode Island. Some of these men ended up at Yorktown. You got Windsor Fry, he was 1775 to 1783. Guy was there for, I mean, they all could have gone home for short periods in between, but he was a soldier the whole time. But probably the biggest legacy, and this was not unique to Rhode Island, I think it took place throughout New England, is that people recognized that slavery wasn't right. And so it was only a year after the war that Rhode Island and then the other New England states and New York and others began working toward abolishing slavery. And that might have been the biggest legacy, is that they realized that these men were there and fought for us. So just showing it again, birthplace of East Greenwich took place right here. You've got 3 great stories here. You've got Varnum, you've got the Kentish Guards, and you have the Black Regiment. Is there one I'm missing? Is there another one? Because most towns I talk to, and I talk to people there, they're struggling trying to find some connection.
The Navy.
The Navy.
Yeah.
We claim it, so do other people, but we win.
There's a few places might argue with you, but I don't.
Yeah, they don't know.
Yeah, that's a good point, because the plaque is right down there on Town Hall. And that will lead me right into another topic here shortly. So Cato Varnum, his name was Cato Vernon when he was enslaved in Newport. His enslaver was one of the biggest slave traders in Rhode Island, William Varnum. How did it become Varnum? I don't know. On the first couple of documents, it's Vernon, all of a sudden it becomes Varnum. And it's like that through the rest of his military records. If I was Cato, and you got a big shot named Varnum that's well known, I would take the name and keep it. That happened a lot. There were a lot of men that went in under one name. Some went in, enlisted under one name and had a totally different first name and surname by the time they got through. But Cato allowed Varnum to continue. Here's a project that I worked on with the National Museum of the U.S. Army. They have a 250 exhibit there, and they have this life-size statue of Cato. And I haven't been there to see it yet, but people that have been there, Patrick and Jason and others, tell me that you can't tell that isn't real. And it probably should look that good because it cost over $40,000 to create it. But here's the best part of that story. It's going to be at the Varnum Armory after this display goes down. I think it's up for only 2 years. So we'll be able to see Cato. And while we're on that topic, there's my good friend Jason Rooms showing his ancestor on the wall over at Patriots Park. So that's one area where we have a real nice memorial. related to men of color. Another place where they have a memorial is at the Battle of Pines Bridge. Unfortunately, the place where Christopher Green and several white and black men were killed by British loyalists, and they have a memorial there. A few of us got together early last year, I guess it was. I kind of lose track of time. But Matt, Patrick Donovan, Jason and I, and a couple other people said, hey, we should see if we can come up with something for the Black Regiment here in East Greenwich. So we've been working with a sculptor. Some of you may have already heard this story. We appeared before the town to discuss it. Hope is to put a memorial in front of Varnum Armory. Going to have a bronze statue of a man from the Black Regiment. And then Jason came up with this idea, and it's a great idea. Have a young boy, obviously an enslaved boy, walking behind and looking up at the heavens as to say, when is my chance going to come? So you'll be hearing more about that hopefully this year. Black History Month. I never talk politics. Marilyn knows this. She's seen me talk many times. I don't talk politics, and I'm not going to talk politics tonight, but we cannot let Black history go away. It doesn't have to be our entire story, but it does need to be part of the story for the Rudder Gardeners that were out there and other people. We can't let that story go away. At Smith's Castle, we don't let it go away. I did research that we determined that by 1651, Richard Smith was bringing enslaved Africans there. How did they get there? He was a big shot with the Dutch West India Company in New Amsterdam, and he was traveling back and forth, and all of a sudden, bang, it became a plantation. Became the model for dozens of plantations. So that one decision to make a plantation there affected literally hundreds, if not thousands, of lives in Rhode Island. And the last enslaved person there was after 1800. So over 150 years, that place was a plantation, and it is also the oldest existing plantation house in America. If you haven't been there, stop down to see it. If you have some extra time, you want to volunteer, we're always looking for help. This year we can always use more docents. And that's the end of my story, and I'd gladly take any questions. Don't disappoint me. I know there's some. Thank you. Anybody got anything? Yes, sir.
Do you know the story of Moses, who was an enslaved person at Smith's Castle?
Oh, yeah.
That joined this regiment with his brother? And when you spoke about the fact that there was a price tag put on these people, he was worth 125 when his brother was only worth 93. So that must have been either an infirmity or an age difference or whatever. Can you just talk to that a little bit?
Sad story about Moses. Never could find an age on him, so we don't know how old he was. But he enlisted early on in March. Caesar, the other updike that enlisted, it was a day or two before him or after him. But sad story with Moses, he died December of 1778 of disease. So he didn't make it very far into the war. And that brings up a good point. Many more men died of disease. I think 25,000 men died on the American side, and disease, I think, was something in the teens, where on the battlefield it was closer to 6,000 maybe. Yeah. So that's not much more on Moses other than that. Some of these men, a lot of information, a lot of muster rolls, lengthy pension records where they tell about their service. One of the stories I found recently that is a terrible story. a man found out that one of these men, now they didn't get a pension until 1819, all those years after the war, decades after the wars. Most of them were in poor health and incapable of working. But one man I found over in Portsmouth had, before the war, he was a free man and he had built a house and he had borrowed money from a man over in Portsmouth to help allow him to finish up the house. And he came back after the war, lived in the house, and as soon as his neighbor found out that he got a pension, he went to court to claim the money from the pension because he had bought him a few boards to finish up the house. That's the kind of stories that are sadly associated with these men. Okay, yes, sir.
Wasn't there a significant contribution by these people at Yorktown? You know, that last,
Yes.
like with Hamilton and that last redoubt there?
Yes. Three men from that unit, one of them was Cato Varnum. Three black men from that unit became part of this light infantry that Stephen Olney put together, hand-picking men from the Rhode Island Regiment to be part of a specific company of light, and they were part of the ones that took that redoubt at Yorktown. So that's why Cato ended up high on the list. They gave me a list of things. Somebody that was at Yorktown, well, that narrowed it down pretty quick. But the rest of the men were there, and there was at least one man from the regular Rhode Island Regiment that was killed there, and a couple others that were wounded. So they were near the action. They just weren't as close as that group of men.
That list of recruits by race, you have indigenous,
Yes.
but they were not enslaved.
Only one of them that I found was. And more than likely, like I said before, the slavery for indigenous people was really close to non-existent. And, excuse me, we see that. Even going through the military records, indigenous men living in white households, which could be an indicator that they were enslaved, significantly low. And I think that's where part of the story, and people get offended saying that the Black Regiment wasn't just black men. Well, I didn't name it that, but it was really the majority of the men that enlisted that were indigenous were free indigenous people, almost all of them from Charlestown. And I think people see that all of those men participated and they want to think they were part of the Black Regiment. But really, you got to look at the Black Regiment when it was that segregated unit and not what happened afterward. So they were part of the Rhode Island Regiment, the indigenous people. They just weren't at that time period that the Black Regiment existed. Who's next? Yes, ma'am.
Hi. My name's Debbie. I have, let's see, I think I had at least 7 ancestors that fought in the Revolutionary War. I've been a Protestant resident at Bunker Hill Community College, so I've done a mural about that battle at Bunker Hill. And right now, I've had one person, I'm an artist, so I did a one-person show at Bunker Hill. And now I'm putting together a show at Warwick Museum called Autash Revolution, which means stand up and fight in the revolution. So if anybody has information that they want to contribute, we're putting that show together now. And do you Do you know the name Simeon Simon?
Oh, yeah,
Okay,
yep. He was one of the ones, I believe, that, I
He's an
think,
ancestor. I
Yeah.
know about him. And
yep,
then I had Primus Slocum.
Yep.
Him.
yep,
And then there's Luther Lincoln, George Abel, Ben Abel, John Chowan. There's a lot, I have a lot of ancestors that fought in it.
I'm glad you brought that up. It's great that we continue telling this history, and it gives me the opportunity to say two things. First, there were many indigenous men that participated in the local militias, in the state militias that aren't included in these numbers. And I'm not sure why so many decided after 1781. That's when a great number of indigenous men enlisted. But you named Primus Slocum, and I'll just bore you with this story quick. I'm doing a presentation on the Black Regiment up in Taunton a few years ago, and I had gone through the records for Primus Slocum, his pension records, and I see that there was a request back in the 1950s for someone wanting information on Primus. So that led me to believe that he probably still had some,
I'm a descendant.
yeah, he still had some descendants. So I took a shot. I said, any chance that somebody in this room is related to Primus Slocum? And it was, a woman raised her hand. She was a white woman that was a descendant of Primus Slocum. Interesting story, I thought.
Primus was married to a woman named Mary Alabine, Abel, and she was Anwan's granddaughter. And her sister was Sarah Pequot,
Okay.
and she was married to Paul Huffey. So Primus and Paul were brother-in-laws.
Yep. A lot of us are related to people that fought in the American Revolution, assuming you have any ancestry that goes back into the early days of New England and the other states. But there's also the story of many of us that identify as white that find out later in life that there's some secrets in your family tree. And funny thing, I'll bore you with one other story here. I did my master's thesis on Reconstruction, and I was always very interested in the story of enslavement. And then, about 6-7 years ago, I'm working on my family tree, and I sent in my DNA and everything, and it comes back Nigerian. I said, what is that all about? And it turned out there was a spot in my family tree that I had come to a dead end, and I've got a whole section of my family that was people of color, and going all the way back to Virginia, a mother and son that were enslaved in Virginia. So 5% of all Americans that identify as white have African ancestry. So just throwing that. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I know that Windsor Fry fought in 9 Revolutionary battles.
Yep.
Did he fight at Yorktown?
He was at Yorktown. Again, the men were there. There were men that were killed and wounded there that were close enough to the action for that to happen. I would bet if he had a gun in his hand, Windsor was firing away. That would be my guess. Yep. Yes, sir.
What do we know, if anything, about the re-enlistment rates of the formerly enslaved? Meaning they reached their end of the term of service and they decided to stay in the
I should have thrown that in there, and I thank you for bringing that up. They were required, the enslaved men were required to serve until the end of the war. So if you look at the muster roll, it'll say DW on it during the war. So they had to stay. They didn't all stay. Some were able to get away. Maximum penalty was execution. None of these men were executed that got away, but several of them were flogged for attempting to get away.
That's interesting because I've heard and that a lot of them stayed in because even if they reached their end of their service, they had nowhere to go.
But,
They had no homes. They were former slaves.
yeah,
So they could stay in the Army and have a kind of home and family or become homeless.
yeah, that happened. I know that happened with some of the free men, quite a few free men of color that enlisted in 1777. And some of them left in 1780 and not all of them did. And I found some kind of questionable behavior on the part of the Continental officers, where I found where the man on his first muster after enlisting, it says that it's a 3-year term, and he tried to leave and they wouldn't let him leave when the 3 years were up. Hey, you guys got the records right there. Bureaucracy was just as bad back then as it is today. Yes.
So I don't know how they structured their command back then, but were the non-coms, did they have non-coms? So part I don't know. And were they black?
Simple answer, there were 3, they did have non-coms, 3 men of color eventually were given the rank of corporal, but it didn't last very long. That was as close as they got to anything above being a private or a musician. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, just to clarify, I'm interested in the Richard Green reference.
Yep.
And to clarify, Richard Green was a third cousin of the Greens at Forge Farm. He actually lived out where Rocky Hill is at this point.
Okay.
And he, I understand, was a slaveholder. And so one of the questions I was wondering was whether there are a couple of Greens on the roster, and I wondered if they would have been
One of them was
enslaved
Richard.
people at his place.
There were two Cato Greens. One of them was designated Cato R. Green for Richard. The other was Cato W. Green for William Green, who became governor. So, I don't know. 187 men. Usually I'm a little quicker at this, but one of them killed fairly early on in the war. I can't remember which one it was. But here's an interesting story that reminds me of something. So Cato W. Green, they passed the law on the 14th. Cato W. Green, who lives in the household of the man about to become governor, is the first man to enlist under the act. So whether he heard some talk in the house or what, but that next day he was gone. He was the first man of the enslaved men to enlist.
Didn't the slave owners put one of their slaves into the war so that they didn't have to go? They went for them?
That's a great question. There's documentation of it with the state militia. I find nothing in the records, and I'll kind of leave that as a little hint, but my book is going to have a whole chapter on that exact topic, because let's just say I found some stuff.